Hi.
I don't usually post here, but I need some place to spill everything, maybe get some advice or at least a way to wrap my head around all this. My name's David, and I've spent the last 15 years building my tech company from scratch. It started as an idea in my garage and now, well, let's just say it's my pride, my baby. I thought I was doing everything right. I worked hard, I provided, I put in the hours and energy to build something stable and reliable for my family. I was coming back from a business trip to Chicago, dead tired but also excited to see my wife Laura and our daughter Tia. You know, usual stuff. Grab a cup of coffee, catch up on the week's gossip, enjoy a quiet night back in my own bed. I'd even grabbed a little something for both of them because it's nice to come home with a surprise, right? It makes you feel appreciated, like the family missed you. Anyway, I got in later than expected, almost midnight. I was careful not to make noise, trying to keep it low-key, not wake anyone up. But as I walked past the study, I heard voices, Laura's and our daughter Tia's. Normally, it'd be nothing unusual, but this time, something felt off. They were laughing softly, almost conspiratorially, and then I caught another voice. It was Kenny, Laura's so-called friend, from her real estate job. Now, I didn't immediately jump to conclusions, but hearing his voice that late in my house? Yeah, that stopped me in my tracks. I stayed quiet, easing myself closer to the door, just listening. And that's when I heard it all. They were discussing plans to strip me of my company, my assets, everything I've ever worked for. So I'm standing there, listening in, and my brain's doing backflips. At first, I think, no way. This has to be some misunderstanding. But then Laura's voice cuts through, crystal clear. She's saying stuff like, once we get his assets sorted, Kenny, you and I can move into the big house. Tia will be set up for college, and David, well, he'll be out of the way. The words hit me like a gut punch. I know Laura and I had been distant lately, sure. But that's marriage, right? You have your good times, your hard patches. I always figured if things were rocky, it'd pass. I never dreamed she'd actually want me out of the picture, my own wife and daughter, teaming up with her boyfriend to wipe out everything I built. Just when I think it can't get any worse, Tia chimes in. My own kid. And she's laughing, telling Laura and Kenny how easy it'll be to convince Dad to hand over certain financials because he's so trusting, it's honestly sad. She even jokes about how he never double-checks anything, like I'm some naive fool. I've been in business long enough to know how to watch my back, but I never once thought I'd need to do that with my own family. The two people I'd kill for, who I'd do anything to protect, were plotting to take me down. I wanted to burst in right there and then, confront them on the spot, demand answers. But something in me, some instinct, held me back. I realized I needed to get smart about this. If they were planning to take me for all I was worth, I couldn't afford to blow up and give myself away. So I stepped back quietly, went down to the basement, and stayed up the rest of the night, just replaying everything I heard, trying to figure out my next move. The next morning, I left the house early, telling Laura I had some urgent work stuff to take care of. She didn't even bat an eye, just gave me this quick, absent smile and went back to her coffee like it was any other day. Seeing her act so normal, like she wasn't planning to wreck my life, made my blood boil. But I kept it together. I had to. I knew I'd have to be careful, so I started setting things in motion. First, I went to my bank to quietly start the process of moving some of my accounts to offshore holdings. Nothing big enough to alert anyone, but enough that I'd have a safe cushion tucked away if things went south. Next, I called my assistant Tom. Tom's been with me for years, loyal, smart, the kind of guy who'd take a bullet for me if it came down to it. I didn't tell him everything, just enough for him to know something serious was going on, and that I'd need his help. Then, I started on the surveillance. I put cameras and mics around the house, my office, the study, the living room, even in the kitchen. Anywhere I thought they might be scheming, I made sure I'd be able to hear every word. And it didn't take long to pay off. For the next week, I spent every night holed up in my office, reviewing the footage. I listened to Laura and Kenny's little meetings and caught every smug, entitled word they said. Every plan they hatched to take me for all I had. They didn't even hide it. There was this one night I'll never forget. Laura was sitting there, swirling her wine, laughing about how David never sees anything coming. She actually said, he's so buried in his work, he probably wouldn't notice if I cleaned out the accounts overnight. Hearing her talk about me like I was some clueless, disposable fool? I can't even describe that feeling. Tia wasn't innocent in any of this either. She seemed almost excited. She'd ask Laura if she could get her new car when it was all over, or talk about how she'd be the one to manage Dad's business once Kenny took over. She'd say things like, "It's just business, Mom. Dad's in the way, that's all." My own daughter, talking about me like I was some obstacle she needed to bulldoze over for her own benefit. Now, I'm a patient man, but seeing my own flesh and blood planning my downfall? That was a different kind of betrayal. But every time I wanted to confront them, I'd remind myself that if I wanted to stop them, I needed real, irrefutable proof. Evidence that could hold up in court, that would leave them with nothing once I exposed them. By the second week, my plan started to come together. I kept moving funds into secure accounts, creating a firewall around my business assets. I knew Laura and Kenny would try to access my company finances through my laptop, so I set a few traps, placing false information in folders they'd no doubt snoop through. Sure enough, a couple of days later, I caught Laura on camera going through my files. She was grinning, looking all smug, thinking she was 2 steps ahead. And while she was busy with that, I was working on taking down Kenny. I hired a private investigator to dig into his background. Turns out, he wasn't just a shady boyfriend, he was a career scam artist. He'd married twice, scammed both wives out of their savings, and left them bankrupt. He'd also been involved in some fraudulent real estate deals that had led to a few lawsuits. No big surprise, but knowing I could use this against him was like having a loaded weapon in my back pocket. I knew I couldn't just wait around forever. The more I dug, the more I realized I needed to make my move soon. Laura was getting bolder, even asking if I'd be open to a joint account for the family. I told her I'd think about it, putting on my best poker face. Meanwhile, I started quietly prepping my legal team, just in case things got messy. Then one night, I heard Laura telling Tia, "By next month, we'll be living the life we deserve. Once we're in charge, you can have whatever you want, sweetheart." That was it. I knew the time had come. I spent that night finalizing every detail of my plan. The surveillance footage I'd collected was enough to bury Laura and Kenny in legal hell, but I wanted more. I wanted them to feel the weight of every lie, every betrayal. I wanted to take away any illusion they had of controlling me or my company. And for Tia, I needed to confront her too, no matter how much it hurt. The next morning, I called Tom and asked him to meet me at my office. I laid everything out, Laura's betrayal, the recordings, Kenny's history, and Tia's involvement. Tom was visibly shaken, but he didn't hesitate to support me. He even suggested we move up some security protocols to ensure no one outside of us had access to sensitive files. We spent the rest of the day transferring critical assets, moving the bulk of my finances to untouchable accounts, and setting up a system to lock out anyone who tried to gain unauthorized access. Meanwhile, Laura must have sensed something was off because she sent me a string of texts around lunchtime. "Everything okay? You've seemed a little distant lately, and finally, can we talk?" It was almost laughable. After all she'd plotted behind my back, she was worried that I might be the distant one. That night, I finally set things in motion. First, I made sure my legal team had everything they needed. They were ready to move the moment I said the word. I also sent all the surveillance footage and PI reports on Kenny to our trusted lawyer. He'd be prepared to draft charges not only for infidelity but for conspiracy to commit fraud and asset theft. The next day, I decided to start with Kenny. I wanted to hit him where it hurt. So, I called up a few contacts in the industry and shared the intel on his past scams. By the end of the day, word of Kenny's shady deals was spreading like wildfire. I heard later that his clients started pulling out of deals, and his reputation was sinking fast. It wouldn't be long before he'd be blacklisted from the real estate business altogether. That evening, I came home early, and Laura looked surprised. She asked if everything was all right, her voice dripping with fake concern. I could tell she was on edge, like she knew something was coming. I looked her in the eyes and said, "Yeah, actually, I think it's time we had a family meeting. You, me, Tia, all of us. We need to talk." Laura hesitated, glancing toward the stairs. "Sure. I'll call Tia down," she said, her voice wavering just a bit. I nodded, letting her feel that first touch of fear. When Tia came down, I sat them both in the living room, a serious expression on my face. They looked at me, not realizing they were about to face the reckoning they deserved. I kept my cool, letting the silence build tension until Laura finally broke. "David, what's going on? You're scaring us," she said, forcing a worried look. I took a deep breath, meeting both of their gazes. I know everything, I said, each word steady and clear. I know about you and Kenny. I know about the plans to take my company. And I know, Tia, that you were helping your mother plan every step of it. The color drained from Laura's face, and Tia's mouth dropped open. It was like they'd been hit by a truck. They sat there, stunned, not even able to speak. The silence hung in the room like a storm cloud. Laura's face twisted from shock to anger, but she quickly masked it, switching to her usual act. David, what are you talking about? This is ridiculous. You're misunderstanding something, she stammered, trying to sound innocent. She glanced over at Tia, who looked completely blindsided, like she hadn't expected me to call her out. But I was done with their lies. Don't waste my time with excuses, Laura. I have proof. Recordings of every conversation, every single word. I know about the joint account you tried to set up. I know about the meetings with Kenny. And Tia, I turned to my daughter, whose face was a mix of panic and guilt. I know you helped them. I heard everything. Tia's eyes filled with tears. Dad. I'm sorry. I didn't really mean, she started, her voice trembling, but I cut her off. You didn't mean what, Tia? I asked, keeping my voice steady even though seeing her like this hurt more than I wanted to admit. Didn't mean to hurt me? Or didn't mean to get caught? Laura snapped, dropping the facade. You know what, David? Maybe you're not as smart as you think. You were so wrapped up in your precious company that you neglected your own family. All I did was take advantage of your arrogance. Her voice was cold, bitter. I took a deep breath, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. My arrogance? You really believe that's an excuse to betray your husband? To drag our daughter into it? Laura shrugged, crossing her arms defiantly. You don't get it. I was tired of being your accessory. All you ever cared about was your empire, your reputation. You never cared about us. I just shook my head. You're unbelievable. If you ever felt neglected, you could have talked to me. But you chose to destroy everything instead. Well, congratulations, Laura. You got what you wanted. You and Kenny can have each other. Her smirk faded a bit, as if the reality of her situation was finally sinking in. What are you saying? I'm saying I'm done, I replied, calm and clear. I've already moved the assets out of your reach. You won't see a dime of my money, and neither will Kenny. I've sent everything to my lawyers, and they're building a case against both of you for conspiracy and fraud. By tomorrow, Kenny's reputation will be in shambles, and the two of you will be lucky to come out of this without jail time. At this, Laura's face went pale, her anger replaced with real fear. You can't do that, David. You don't have the right. Oh, I absolutely do, I replied, refusing to let up. But I'm not stopping there. Tia, I turned to my daughter, who had been silent, staring at the floor. I don't know what you thought you were gaining from all of this, but you've made your choice. You and your mother can deal with the consequences together. Tia's voice came out in a whisper, barely audible. Dad, please. I'm sorry. I didn't know. I thought it was just a plan. I didn't think it would really go this far. Her words made me pause for a moment, but I reminded myself that she'd still made her decision. It's too late, Tia. I trusted you. I raised you. And this is how you repay me? You're old enough to know what loyalty is, and you chose betrayal. I can't have people like that in my life, even if they're family. Laura, who looked like she was on the verge of breaking down, suddenly straightened up, her face twisting with desperation. You think you're punishing us, David? But you're just going to end up alone. All you have left is that company and some money. No one who actually cares about you. I let her words roll off me, knowing they were just the last desperate jabs of a woman who had lost. I'd rather be alone than surrounded by people who only see me as a means to an end. I turned and walked toward the door, feeling their stunned silence behind me. But just before I left the room, I stopped, looking back one last time. You wanted to take everything from me, but you ended up with nothing. Goodbye, Laura. Goodbye, Tia. With that, I left the house, finally free from the lies and betrayal that had consumed my life. And this time, I wasn't looking back. Walking out of that house felt like I was shedding a skin, leaving behind everything that had once defined me, my family, my home, even my identity as a father. I drove to a nearby hotel, my hands gripping the steering wheel tight, the silence in the car thick with everything unsaid. I kept replaying the scene over and over, the shock on Tia's face, Laura's bitter words, the finality of it all. I stayed up most of the night, my mind racing, trying to come to terms with what my life had become. By morning, I was ready to move forward. I called my lawyer first thing, confirming the steps we'd discussed. My assets were securely moved, the restraining orders were filed, and our evidence against Laura and Kenny was lined up in case we needed it in court. Every loose end was getting tied up. Once the legal work was underway, I put my plan for Kenny in action. Word of his shady past hit fast, spreading across the industry within hours. By noon, Kenny's real estate firm had suspended him, and several clients were already pulling out of deals. I heard from a few contacts that he was scrambling to save face, but it was too late. His carefully built reputation was crumbling. By evening, he was as good as blacklisted. Laura didn't fare much better. With Kenny's downfall and the rumors of her affair circulating, her social circle evaporated almost overnight. She'd lost the safety net she thought she had, and for the first time, she was facing the consequences alone. The irony of it all, she'd wanted everything, and now she had nothing. Meanwhile, I went back to my company, diving into work with a new kind of focus. It wasn't easy. Some days, the anger and sadness crept back in. But every day, as I rebuilt my life from the ground up, I felt a little lighter. I had my company, my goals, and my freedom. It wasn't the life I'd pictured, but it was mine. And this time, no one else would get to take it from me. In the days that followed, I tried to settle into a new rhythm. My work became my anchor, giving me a sense of purpose and stability that I'd nearly lost. Tom stepped up even more, managing the office with a kind of loyalty that reminded me why I'd trusted him all these years. He never asked too many questions, only quietly ensured everything ran smoothly, and I could tell he wanted me to know he was there for me beyond work. Meanwhile, I couldn't resist keeping tabs on the fallout Laura and Kenny were facing. Kenny, once the charming smooth-talking star in his real estate firm, was now practically radioactive. Several lawsuits had popped up against him, ranging from fraud to shady financial dealings. His career was imploding, and as word of his relationship with Laura spread, he became a joke, the man who thought he could scheme his way to the top and ended up with nothing. Laura, on the other hand, was unraveling even faster. She tried to contact me, emails, voicemails, messages through mutual acquaintances, all ignored. She'd burned every bridge, and her so-called friends began ghosting her. Eventually, her real estate firm, worried about its own reputation, asked her to step down. From what I heard, she was struggling to make ends meet without access to my money, and it was a relief knowing she couldn't touch what I'd worked for. But the hardest part was Tia. She tried reaching out too, leaving messages saying she was sorry, begging to meet so she could explain. But every time I heard her voice, I couldn't shake the betrayal. My own daughter, plotting with her mother to gut me of everything I'd built. It was like a wound that wouldn't heal, and even though a part of me missed her, another part felt resolute. I couldn't let her back in until she fully understood the damage she'd done, if I ever did. So, I kept my distance, trying to rebuild a life without them. Each day, as I went to work and focused on my own path forward, I felt like I was reclaiming a little piece of myself. It wasn't easy, but I knew I was making progress. For the first time in years, I was living for me, not for people who only saw me as a stepping stone. And that alone was worth every painful step I'd taken to get here. A few weeks passed, and I could finally breathe without feeling that crushing weight in my chest. I poured everything I had into work, doubling down on projects and even starting a new one with Tom. We'd always talked about expanding into AI, and now without the distractions at home, I could focus on this dream with everything I had. It was strange, freeing really, how much I could accomplish now that my life was my own again. One afternoon though, something broke the calm. I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something in me wanted to pick up. It was Tia. Her voice sounded small, strained. She asked if we could meet somewhere, just to talk. "Dad, I know you don't want to hear from me, but please. I need you to hear me out. Just one time." Against my better judgment, I agreed. I knew I couldn't just ignore her forever, and maybe a part of me wanted to hear her side. So we met in a quiet cafe, a place out of the way where we wouldn't be seen. She looked different when she walked in, less confident, a little older maybe. I saw the nervousness in her eyes, like she knew she'd lost something she couldn't easily get back. She sat down, barely able to meet my gaze. "Dad, I messed up. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to understand. I didn't know how serious it all was. Mom made it sound different. I stayed quiet, letting her talk. She went on, explaining how Laura had convinced her it was just a plan and that it would be good for both of them. She said it was for us, for our future, Tia said, her voice shaking. I thought I was helping her. I didn't realize it would mean losing you. Tears started to form in her eyes, and she brushed them away, embarrassed. When she finished, she looked at me, waiting, like she was hoping I'd say something that would make this easier for her. But all I felt was an ache, a deep, painful ache I couldn't ignore. Tia, do you understand what you did? I asked, my voice calm but firm. This wasn't just some childish mistake. You plotted with your mother to take everything from me. My trust, my hard work, my life's work, gone, all because you wanted something more. She looked down, visibly shaking. I know, Dad. I know. And I hate myself for it. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to think she'd learn something, that she'd understand why I couldn't just forgive and forget. But the trust was gone, shattered. Tia, I hope you grow from this. I hope you find a way to make things right with yourself. But I can't just erase what happened. Not now. Tia nodded slowly, tears streaming down her face. She got up, wiping her cheeks as she whispered, I'm so sorry, Dad. And with that she walked out, leaving me alone in that quiet cafe, wondering if there would ever be a way to mend the pieces they'd broken. After that meeting with Tia, I felt like I'd closed a chapter. I'd heard her out, but her apology couldn't fix the damage, at least not right now. My life felt permanently split into before and after. Part of me was relieved I'd finally confronted her, but the other part felt emptier than ever. I'd spent years being a father, believing my family was something solid, unbreakable. Now I was standing on the other side of it, facing a future I'd never planned on. That night, as I sat in my office, going over our new AI project, Tom knocked on the door. He came in with a couple of beers, which wasn't like him, but he'd seen the toll this was taking on me. We cracked open the drinks and sat there in silence for a while, just letting the quiet settle around us. Finally, he spoke. You know, David, I've watched you build this place from the ground up. Seen all the sacrifices you made, the hours you put in. None of this was just handed to you. He looked at me, his face serious. But don't let this take away the good you've done. You deserve to be proud of everything you've accomplished. And no one, not Laura, not Tia, not some guy like Kenny, can take that from you. I nodded, grateful for his words. It was the first time I'd felt truly understood through all of this. Tom was right. This company, this work, it was mine, built on my own effort and grit. And if Laura and Tia had tried to rip it away from me, it only proved how little they understood what it meant. Over the next few days, I kept that conversation close to me. I found myself driven to make the company stronger, to protect it against anything or anyone who might try to bring it down. I doubled down on the new project, even deciding to bring in a few more top developers to expand the team. One evening, just as I was leaving the office, I got an email alert. It was from Laura's lawyer. She was officially filing for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. I felt a strange relief mixed with anger. After everything she'd done, she was the one filing? But I welcomed it. I was ready to sever every tie that connected us. So I called my lawyer, moving forward with the divorce without hesitation. And this time, I made it clear that I wouldn't settle for anything less than full protection of my assets. Laura had made her choices, and now she'd face the consequences. With the divorce underway, everything started to move fast. My lawyer was relentless, piecing together every bit of evidence I'd gathered from the recordings, the surveillance, and Kenny's shady past. Laura and Kenny had backed themselves into a corner, and now they'd have to fight their way out of it without a penny of my money. Laura tried to negotiate, reaching out through her lawyer with requests for mediation. She claimed she wanted to resolve things amicably, but I knew her too well to believe it. She was just trying to save face now that her plans had failed. I told my lawyer I wasn't interested in meeting halfway. Laura had taken advantage of my trust, tried to ruin me, and now she'd get exactly what she deserved, nothing. A few days later, I got word that Kenny was in even deeper trouble than I'd thought. More people were coming forward, clients who'd been defrauded by his real estate scams, and several of them were now pursuing criminal charges. If all went as planned, he'd be looking at serious jail time. I couldn't help but feel a grim satisfaction. He'd thought he could steal my life out from under me, But now he'd be lucky if he had anything left when this was over. The media even started to catch wind of the situation. News of Kenny's fraudulent activities spread, and it didn't take long for word about the affair to follow. Laura's reputation was shredded, and suddenly, the so-called friends who'd once idolized her were nowhere to be found. She was left in social isolation, her image tarnished beyond repair. With every step in the divorce process, I felt stronger, like I was reclaiming every part of myself they'd tried to steal. I could finally look forward without the weight of their betrayal pulling me back. I knew there were still hurdles ahead, courts, settlements, and eventually, the reality of living alone. But I'd made it this far, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a strange but undeniable sense of freedom. Once the media got hold of the story, things spiraled fast. Laura's social circle, which had always been her prized possession, dissolved overnight. People who'd once flattered her and invited her to every party were now avoiding her like the plague. I heard from mutual acquaintances that her real estate firm officially terminated her contract, citing ethical concerns, to avoid too much bad publicity. Laura, who'd once strutted around with this aura of untouchability, was now left out in the cold, facing the consequences of her own choices. As for Kenny, his world was crumbling even faster. I got updates through my lawyer and the private investigator, and it was a satisfying chain of events to watch from a distance. Lawsuits stacked up, and his finances dried up as fast as his career prospects. Eventually, the police took action, raiding his office and confiscating files, his computer, anything that could prove he'd scammed people. And from what I heard, there was enough evidence to put him away for years. In the meantime, my lawyer and I moved forward aggressively with the divorce proceedings. Laura's attempts to get a chunk of my assets hit wall after wall, as all our financial records and the surveillance footage painted a clear picture. I was protected by more than just good legal work. I was protected by the cold, hard truth. One day, in the middle of all this, I ran into Tom on my way out of the office. He could see the toll it was taking on me, even though things were working out in my favor. He put a hand on my shoulder and said, "David, you've done everything right. You've handled this like a pro. Don't let them take any more of you than they already have." That hit me, and I realized he was right. I had won, in every sense of the word. I'd outsmarted them, protected my life's work, and was standing on solid ground again. For the first time, I felt the smallest glimmer of peace. With the end of the divorce in sight and Kenny facing legal retribution, I knew it was only a matter of time before I'd fully close this chapter of my life. And as much as I hated what had happened, I realized something. I was free, and this time, no one would take that from me. As the divorce settlement came closer, Laura seemed to grow desperate. She tried every tactic in the book, emails begging for a second chance, attempts to pin the blame on Kenny, even claims that she'd only gone along with the plan because she felt pressured. But her pleas fell flat. The evidence was clear, and there was no rewriting what she'd done. At one point, she even showed up at my office unannounced, demanding to see me. I hadn't spoken to her directly since the day I confronted her, and seeing her standing there in the lobby, looking worn and defeated, reminded me how far she'd fallen. Against my better judgment, I agreed to give her 5 minutes. I figured it'd give me some closure, to look her in the eyes one last time and know I'd made the right choice. She walked into my office, trying to summon that confident, persuasive charm she used to have, but her words came out shaky. "David, I know you're hurt, and I know I made mistakes, but we had a life together. Doesn't that mean anything to you?" I stayed silent, just looking at her. She must have taken it as a sign to keep going. "You have every right to be angry," she continued, her voice trembling. "But I thought, maybe with time we could work things out. For Tia's sake, at least." When she mentioned Tia, I felt a flash of anger. She was still trying to use our daughter to get back in my good graces. "Laura, it's over. You destroyed everything that mattered between us. The life we had. You tore it apart the minute you decided to betray me. I gave you everything, and you turned around and tried to take everything from me." Her face crumpled, but I didn't let her tears sway me. I'd spent too long being manipulated by her emotions. "Please, David," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I have nothing left. Kenny's gone, I lost my job. I just want things to go back to how they were." I shook my head slowly, feeling only the slightest pang of sympathy for the person she'd become. "Laura, there's no going back. You made your choices, and now you're facing the consequences. This conversation is over." With that, I stood up, signaling the end. She looked at me one last time, searching for any trace of the man who'd once loved her, but she found nothing. She left, defeated, and I knew that was the last time I'd ever see her in my office or my life. As I watched her walk away, I felt a final weight lift from my shoulders. The life we'd built was gone, but I was finally ready to move forward, no longer haunted by the betrayal that had nearly taken me down. After that last encounter with Laura, it felt like a door had finally closed for good. I could breathe easier, focus more, and for the first time in months, I started looking forward instead of backward. I wasn't naive. I knew there would be lingering pain and trust issues. But at least now I could rebuild without the shadow of betrayal looming over me. The next week, the final divorce settlement went through. Laura received a minimal payout, barely enough to get by, and I made sure there were ironclad agreements in place preventing her from touching any part of my company or future earnings. As for custody, we agreed Tia would live with her full-time, at least for now. It was a hard pill to swallow, but I needed the space to heal, and Tia needed time to face what she'd done. I threw myself even deeper into work, expanding the AI project and securing new contracts that would propel the company forward. Tom and I became even closer through it all. He became not just my right hand but someone I could actually rely on. He encouraged me to take a break, to get out of the city for a bit, and after some pushing, I agreed. I took a week off and drove upstate to a secluded cabin. Being out there, away from the reminders of my old life, felt like a reset. Each morning, I'd wake up early, watch the sunrise with a cup of coffee, and reflect. I hadn't let myself really process all of it, the anger, the betrayal, the disappointment in Tia. But as the days went by, I started feeling a sense of peace I hadn't known in a long time. One night, sitting by the fire, I caught myself thinking back to happier times, those rare, quiet evenings when I thought I had a real family, a solid foundation. It was bittersweet, but I realized something important. I hadn't lost myself. The parts of me that built this life, that cared for my family, and poured love into my work were still there, buried but intact. As the week ended, I packed up and drove back to the city, feeling different, like I'd reclaimed a part of myself. I knew there was still work to do, healing to be done, and boundaries to be set. But for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt whole again, ready to start living life on my own terms. After that lunch with Tia, I couldn't shake the feeling that things were shifting. Maybe not dramatically, but slowly, like the first hints of dawn after a long night. As much as her betrayal hurt, I realized that cutting her out completely might hurt me even more. She was still young, and now that she was coming to terms with the weight of her actions, I thought that maybe, just maybe, we could rebuild something real between us. A few days later, I got a text from her. She'd started volunteering at a community center as part of a restorative justice program, something she hadn't mentioned during lunch. I thought it would help, she wrote. To learn what it's like to give back instead of just taking. I know I have a long way to go, Dad, but I'm trying. Her message struck a chord in me, and I couldn't deny the small sense of pride that crept in. Maybe she was truly changing, finding her own way out of the mess Laura had dragged her into. As for Laura, the divorce was finalized within weeks. The settlement was simple, direct, and left her with the bare minimum. I knew from mutual acquaintances that she was struggling, jobless, and cut off from the social circles that once made her feel untouchable. Occasionally, she'd send texts, short ones almost pleading, "I know you're angry, but please can we just talk?" Or "This wasn't how I wanted things to end." I never replied. She'd made her bed, and now she was lying in it. Any lingering sympathy had withered long ago, replaced by a determination to move forward without her. Meanwhile, work was flourishing beyond anything I'd anticipated. The AI project was generating serious buzz, and our company was approached by a major investor interested in backing the expansion. I was on calls at all hours, meetings stretched into the evening, and I barely had time to notice the passage of days. But I didn't mind. I was building something meaningful, something secure, and that focus grounded me. It felt like every decision, every late night, was another step away from the wreckage Laura had tried to make of my life. One evening, as I was wrapping up yet another meeting, I found myself staring at a photo on my desk, a family photo from a few years back, when I'd thought everything was fine. Laura had her arm around Tia, both of them smiling up at me. I almost didn't recognize the life in those faces. I'd been fooled into thinking that happiness was secure, that loyalty was a given. Now, I knew better. I'd learned painfully that trust and loyalty weren't gifts. They were things you had to protect, things that could be taken away without a moment's notice if you weren't careful. A few days after that, Tia asked if we could meet again, and this time, she suggested we do something casual. How about a hike like we used to, she asked, sounding hopeful. Hiking had been our thing once. Quiet mornings, just the two of us, talking about life as we climbed up some trail or other. She knew how much I loved the mountains and probably thought that getting out there would help bridge the distance between us. So that Saturday, we met early and drove out of the city, making our way up a familiar trail. The air was crisp, and the trees were bright with the colors of early fall. We started slow, neither of us talking much at first, just letting the rhythm of the trail guide us. But eventually, Tia started opening up. She told me about school, her plans for the future, and even admitted that she distanced herself from some of the people she used to hang out with. I'm realizing they weren't really my friends, Dad. They only wanted to be around me because of what I could give them. There was a hard truth in her words, and I could tell she was wrestling with guilt and regret, just as I had been. We reached the overlook at the top, both of us a bit out of breath, and sat down on a rock, looking out at the valley below. For a long moment, we just sat there in silence, watching as the wind moved through the trees. Finally, she looked over at me and asked, "Do you think you could ever trust me again?" I didn't answer right away. I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully. Trust isn't something that just comes back, Tia. It's like rebuilding a bridge. It takes time, patience, and a lot of work. But you're making the right steps. You're showing me that you're willing to try. And that means something. Her eyes filled with tears, but she quickly brushed them away. Thank you, Dad. I won't let you down again. I promise. We sat there for a while longer, watching as the sun began to dip lower in the sky. And in that quiet, I felt something shift between us. A fragile new beginning, one that would take time, but one I was willing to nurture. As we made our way down the trail, talking about little things, our favorite hikes, places we wanted to visit, memories of past trips, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. It wasn't the life I'd imagined, but it was a life I could build on. Tia and I still had a long road ahead, but for the first time in a long time, I felt hope, not just for my future, but for our relationship. By the time we reached the bottom, the sun had nearly set, casting a warm golden light over the trail. We stood there, quietly taking it in, and I realized that despite everything, I had something real again. Something no one could take from me. And that feeling, that hard-won peace, was worth every painful step it had taken to get here. In the months following the launch of the AI project, life finally felt like it was moving in the right direction. I had poured everything into the company, and watching it grow, seeing the new partnerships unfold, felt like validation of all the pain I'd pushed through. I'd transformed my losses into something stronger, something entirely my own. Tia and I kept meeting, cautiously rebuilding trust. One weekend, she even came by my place with dinner, a small olive branch that surprised me. I saw in her small genuine efforts a desire to mend what she could, and it softened something in me that I hadn't realized was still so tense. I was beginning to see Tia less as the daughter who had betrayed me and more as someone grappling with her own choices, coming to terms with the fallout just as I had. One evening, as we sat at the kitchen table after dinner, she finally brought up something we'd both been avoiding. "Dad, I know it's still hard to talk about, but I've been doing a lot of thinking, a lot of reflecting on how we got here." She paused, her fingers tracing the rim of her water glass. "Sometimes I wonder what life would be like if none of this had happened, if I hadn't believed all those things about you that Mom said." I took a deep breath, weighing my response carefully. "Tia, I think about that too. But the truth is, the life I thought I had back then wasn't real, not the way I thought it was. Your mom had been lying to both of us for a long time." I watched her nod, and I could see the regret in her eyes, the weight of understanding. "What's important now is what we do with what we've learned. And I'm proud of you for taking responsibility. You're doing the work, and that means more than you know." She smiled faintly, and I realized this conversation, this quiet acceptance of the past, was another layer of healing. We sat in silence for a moment, letting the gravity of everything settle around us. It felt like we were both releasing something heavy that had been sitting between us all this time. Meanwhile, Laura's downfall had taken on a life of its own. Her bankruptcy case became the talk of our old social circles, and I'd occasionally hear updates from mutual acquaintances. She had burned through every bridge and every penny, and now she was trying to appeal to anyone who might give her a second chance. Her lawyer's earlier request that I help her financially was followed by another desperate email from Laura herself, begging for support and this time, trying to play on my sympathy. "I know I made mistakes," she wrote, "but I'm asking for help for the sake of our history. I have nothing left. I reread her email, feeling nothing but a distant, detached sense of closure. I didn't respond. There was no satisfaction in her suffering, but there was a sense of justice in her having to face what she'd done without anyone to hide behind. This was a life of her own making, and no amount of pleading or manipulation could change that. Around the same time, the company was taking off in ways I'd once only dreamed of. Investors were reaching out, partnerships were forming, and we were even approached by a major tech firm interested in a merger. Each new opportunity felt like another step forward, proof that I was building something resilient, something unstoppable. Tom became my closest confidant, more like a brother than just an assistant. He'd been there through it all, the dark days and the victories, and he knew exactly what each of those milestones meant to me. One day, as we celebrated signing a major new deal, Tom handed me a small engraved plaque he'd had custom-made. It read, "From ashes, greatness rises." I looked up at him, unable to hide the emotion in my eyes. He just nodded, as if to say, "You've earned this." That plaque now sits on my desk, a reminder that I'd taken what others tried to burn down and built something indestructible from the rubble. With the company flourishing, I decided it was time to give back in a way that went beyond business. I started a foundation focused on supporting young entrepreneurs, people with dreams and ideas but without the resources to bring them to life. I wanted to give others a chance to build something real, something that couldn't be easily taken away. It felt like a new purpose, something that honored the path I'd walked. Through all this, Tia and I grew closer. Our relationship was still fragile, but it was healing with each honest conversation, each time we chose to spend time together instead of apart. One afternoon, she even joined me at the foundation, volunteering with some of the young people who'd received grants. Seeing her interact with them, watching her offer genuine advice and encouragement, made me feel like I was seeing the best version of her, a Tia untainted by Laura's influence. One evening, after a long day at the foundation, Tia and I grabbed dinner at a nearby diner. She looked over at me and said, "Dad, I'm really proud of you. You've been through so much, but you didn't let it break you. I don't think I've ever really told you that before." Hearing that from her hit me harder than I expected. "Thank you, Tia. And I'm proud of you too. You've made mistakes, but you're doing everything you can to make them right. That takes strength." As we walked out of the diner that night, I realized that the pain, the betrayal, it had all led to this. I'd rebuilt not only my life and my company, but my relationship with my daughter. It wasn't the life I'd originally envisioned, but in many ways, it was better. I was surrounded by people who cared about me for who I was, not for what I could give them. I had a company, a purpose, and a family, one I could finally trust. That night, as I sat alone in my living room, looking out over the city lights, I felt a profound sense of peace. It wasn't the same life I'd once had, but it was real, solid, and mine. And as I thought about the future, I felt a quiet excitement building, the kind that only comes after you've been through the darkest valleys and survived. From the ashes of betrayal, I'd built something that no one could take away. And this life, this second chance, I knew without a doubt that it was only the beginning of what was to come.
Bye.